The most popular scientist in the media these days is Neil deGrasse Tyson, who is an astrophysicist. And he said, "We are all connected to each other biologically, to the earth chemically, and to the rest of the universe atomically." M. Scott Peck, the late psychiatrist and self-help author, wrote a book about creating community called A Different Drum. It's regrettably dated. It was written in the midst of the Cold War, and a lot of it would not apply today. It was written pre-internet and at a time when the world was defined more by East and West nuclear threat than by the divisions that exist about religious fundamentalism today. But there is a chapter, chapter 9 in the book, A Different Drum. The chapter is entitled Patterns of Transformation. And I think that particular chapter is as helpful as anything that you find in his more famous book, The Road Less Traveled. He describes the movement that we take in spiritual evolution from childhood chaos into institutional and dogmatic religion, followed by a time of questioning and doubt. The persistent and the fortunate find their way through the emptiness of that skepticism and doubt into a fourth stage of spiritual evolution, one that has a more mystical approach but offers a synthesis between what can be rationally known combined with that sense of awe and wonder associated with a spiritual perspective on life. Now, I hate to brush over something this important, but if you'll allow me just a very brief summation. Children are born into a frightening universe populated by giants, in which they have little or no control over anything that happens to them, where they are, what they eat, when they sleep, or whatever. And in many instances, children, through religious training and stories, resolve their early childhood anxieties through being incorporated into the formal institutional religion that gives them solid answers to life's big questions, that resolves the fears of life by giving you a pathway that if you follow that, you can become one of God's best friends and avoid becoming an enemy of the universe. Those answers, however, in that stage 2 of institutional religion, those answers don't hold much water when they are critically examined. Now, most people will never dismiss them outright. They just move their importance way down so that they can remain just tacitly Jewish or Christian or Muslim. And in that way, they get to keep a little bit of divine fire insurance without letting institutional religion interrupt their lives too much. If people took traditional Christianity literally, we would see a lot of people selling everything they own, giving the proceeds to the poor, and leading the remainder of their lives like ascetic monks. But we, in fact, rarely see anything other than very symbolic devotion to the weightier demands of traditional faith. Most people hold on to a symbolic fragment of religion, sometimes using it to excuse their own failings and sometimes using it to pass judgment on the failings of others. But rarely do you see anyone letting it actually change the way they act. Sadly, most institutions of religion are pretty satisfied with that arrangement. They are holding on to members who at least visit now and then. They offer some financial support and a bit of goodwill that allows the institutions to continue to exist. But the more persistent critical thinkers will find the courage to swim against the current of family, society, and will grow to be entirely dismissive of the truth claims, the unsubstantiated truth claims that are associated with religion. Most of Northern Europe already has. Coastal North America have already arrived at that third stage where hardly anyone goes to church. I remember my time at Harvard when one of the most brilliant preachers that has lived in our era preached almost every Sunday morning at Memorial Church on Harvard's campus, and you could look around the room and there would be maybe 200 people that were there of their own volition and another 200 that were paid to be there by some music scholarship or some other related scholarship related to the university. But now Middle America is following suit. We see some of the great big Six Flags Over Jesus kind of institutions rising up in major cities, but by and large, church attendance is declining as a percentage of population, and it's declining very rapidly. And that was very much what Mark Scott Peck's own journey through his childhood and evolving awareness into medical school and psychiatric training. He grew up in New York, and though his parents didn't go to church, he was sent to a Presbyterian church on Fifth Avenue where my preaching professor's father, George Buttrick, regularly preached. But he was one of the ones who, once he grew up, took medical training and psychiatric training and had dismissed religion, wouldn't quite give up on the search for something more than just individual skepticism. He pressed on to find a faith that both embraced the science that he had been taught with a mystical awareness of how we are connected to one another and we are connected to the universe. I actually had a chance to have a brief private conversation with M. Scott Peck in the late 1980s. And after a short conversation, he advised me to leave the ministry as quickly as possible. He said to me, "There is no more spirit left in the church. You need to find a better way to help build community in the world than any church would ever let you actually do." It was not the advice I was expecting from him. I was really looking for help about why church seemed to have so many moral flaws that we just couldn't seem to get over. But he was willing to just give up on the project. 25 years later, I think I can say that Scott Peck was both right and wrong. I don't have much hope for denominational Christianity or in much of what goes on in mosques or synagogues and churches of the 21st century unless they are willing to undergo radical transformation. They cannot have a future while they remain attached to ancient myths that fly in the face of modern reason. Institutions of religion tend to discourage critical thinking in favor of traditional loyalty. Even many churches that will publicly boast, that will put it on the front cover of their church bulletin, that will put it on the signs out front, that they are tolerant of questions, they are tolerant of even atheists and agnostics. But what you find is that it doesn't take very many weeks before they are expecting you to begin to conform to traditional superstition and magic. It is horribly disappointing that so many of the great minds of our era were presented early in their lives with a choice between either reason or belief, between religious superstition or science. Richard Dawkins was raised in an Anglican church, and he said he was in his mid-teens when he began to compare what he was being taught in church with what he was learning about science, and he realized that science was telling the truth and that the church was not. He not only abandoned faith in favor of science, but he has since devoted a great deal of passion and energy to publishing very aggressive attacks on religion, publishing books that implore people to give up on talk about God or faith entirely. He said that there is a new wave of reason that is sweeping across America, Britain, Europe, Australia, South America, the Middle East, and Africa, where superstition once had a firm hold. I actually hope that he's right, but I do not believe that that wave of reason needs to sweep away all forms of spiritual community. In fact, I'm depending on that wave of reason to help the church to become healthy again. But Dawkins is not alone in turning his back on religion in favor of rational thought and scientific inquiry. Recognizing that the religion of our parents and the doctrinal claims of traditional Judaism, Christianity, and Islam simply do not stand up to the light of reason, necessarily gives us an experience of loss. It's not that traditional religion had no value to us. It is that traditional religion had a great deal of value to us at one point in our lives. And so we give it up only with a lot of weeping and gnashing of teeth. It is a painful loss for people. Every day I talk with and receive mail from people who are hurt and angry that they've been lied to by their church. They've been deceived, manipulated, and made to feel guilt and shame by the religious authorities, by family members, by friends. And yet they still somehow want to salvage something of their faith tradition. But you can hardly blame them for having trust issues. It's entirely understandable that when you realize what a mental prison that religious superstition has been, that you might want to run and have nothing ever to do again with anything that uses the language of church, synagogue, mosque, or temple. But at the risk of sounding a bit ironic, I believe that the future of the church is absolutely dependent upon large numbers of people adamantly rejecting and vacating the institutions that have perpetuated Bronze Age myths. It's difficult for anyone to receive what progressive faith has to offer until they have the courage to let go of the security blanket of a familiar, though terribly outgrown religion. Most of the members of the progressive congregation where I'm the pastor have spent years in the in-between region, having left traditional churches, but having had no will to go in search of something that was simultaneously rational while being open to spiritual perspectives. Only gradually have you and I allowed ourselves to recognize that being part of an organization that is defined as a church has something to offer us that is greater than what was taken from us in the abusive practices of institutional churches. Still, for many of us, the question rings on, why bother? Why bother with any kind of church or spiritual community? And there's not just a very clear, simple answer to that. When I left denominational ministry, I vowed never to set foot in a church again. And I'm not entirely free of those sentiments every day, even as I'm working on writing this book about progressive faith in practice. I am aware that institutions of religion have promoted wars, violent oppression of the poor, of minorities, of women, of homosexuals, of the divorced, and sometimes just free thinkers. People have been condemned by institutional religion for just not believing that the earth is flat and that snakes talk. The victims of religious institution number in the billions, even today, as gay people try to act like they're straight, marry into heterosexual relationships, and try to lead a straight life to avoid the condemnation of their family or their faith community, which has driven millions to suicide and into substance abuse, infidelity, and family violence. I believe when the world finally wakes up to let gay people be gay and straight people be straight, that you will immediately reap a huge benefit of a decrease in domestic violence and in substance abuse and in suicide. But in traditional churches still, young women and men have their critical thinking skills curtailed by religious insistence being forced on them to pretend that they believe what is clearly not rational. The young grow up with confused feelings of self-loathing, fear of their own bodies, neurotic guilt for having sexual impulses or appetites that really are purely human, without which the human race would not have survived. And that's before we even get into the matters of church politics, where many of us who have been employed by churches have literally been tortured. What brought me back to the church was my awareness that I still have a need to connect. Humans are, after all, pack animals. We have an existential longing to be connected to one another, even though after millions of years of evolution, you have to admit we're not especially good at it, and yet we have a need to do it. The last few years that I was in the employ of a traditional church, the greatest meaning of my work life, of my professional life, was the work we were doing on the Louisiana coast with Hurricane Katrina victims and among the poor of rural Nicaragua. When I left parish ministry, I found that listening to the news had an entirely different feeling. In the days following Katrina's devastating landfall on the Gulf Coast, I was able to pull together teams of volunteers, raise financial support, and head down to the coast to help people reclaim their lives. But as an individual, separate and apart from a church, learning of natural disasters produced feelings of depression and sorrow and sympathy, but I had no meaningful way to respond beyond the meager attempt of simply sending a cash donation. But in community, when I'm in community, I'm able to be involved with what Bruce Cockburn so beautifully and poetically described as kicking at the darkness until it bleeds daylight. I am a part of a community that every week takes hot meals to hundreds of unsheltered homeless people in our hometown. On my own, I might want to do that, but my efforts would be at best symbolic, occasional, sporadic. But in community, we encourage one another, we inspire one another, we don't give up, we continue to provoke and needle each other to stay involved, to go back the next week, to plan to do it again next month, so that now for years, every Thursday and Friday, our church members are found standing among the most destitute, the most impoverished people of our city, which is where every faith community ought to be found. The comedian Jon Stewart has said that if you don't stick to your values when they're being tested, they're not values, they're hobbies. I'm afraid that in most cases, when we are not a part of a faith community, our convictions largely just reside inside our own skulls. They're not even hobbies, they're just opinions. They may be passionately held. They may be expressed vehemently on Facebook posts, but we're much less likely to actually do anything that helps anybody if we're not a part of a community. I'm confident that if for whatever reason this congregation were to cease to exist, that most of the good work that we are doing would simply go undone. But we remain disciplined because we are together in meaningful service. And that is because we continue to meet together, to study together, and to actually engage in these activities together. Those who abandon the church oftentimes have very similar views. Their opinions may be just like ours. But as loners, they are of very little use to what society is getting done. And secondly, and I'm going to have to ask for some forgiveness in advance, I guess. That's a hard exchange, I guess. But my second reason is that I have this theory about humanity. And there's not many original things you can say. Almost everything you've ever heard me say, I got from somewhere. That's, I can't really lay claim to very many original ideas. But I have this one theory of psychology that is mine. And it requires being expressed in language that's not really church talk. So please forgive me. But it is Roger Ray's theory regarding asses. And it is this. I believe that absolutely everyone on earth will be just as big of an ass as the people around them will allow them to be. Without close community with others, our tendency is to become very narcissistic. Our tendency is to believe that our opinions are important because they're our opinions. And we can become a genuine ass if we are not in close community with people who are somehow pushing back and helping us to correct, helping us to assess ourselves and our values. Now, in the academic world, we call this peer review. We place a tremendous value on peer review, and that is anything that you discover in your laboratory, any theory that you come up with in your math class, even a lot of what you do in an art studio or that you write in terms of poetry or literature is subjected to peer review. And peer review helps you to know whether it's right or wrong, whether it's an improvement or a loss. Now, it doesn't always work because sometimes your peers are asses too. But in truth, Any substantive progress in medicine, in science, in physics, in art, in literature, in theology, are dependent on peer review. And it's one of the problems with people that just, me and God, my personal religion, they're not subjecting their thinking to peer review. And that's how their spirituality can become so narcissistic in nature. But as long as we are in close contact with each other, we improve our chances of not being an ass. That's, and if you quote me on this, please do credit me, because that I may have to publish that sometime. We need each other to provoke one another to good deeds, to check one another when our egos and our ideas become irrational. Being in a faith community is similar to submitting ourselves regularly to peer review. Buddhism teaches that one of the greatest of illusions is our sense that we are separated. Interesting then when scientists, and specifically physicists, start to sound like Buddha when they speak of how we are, in fact, all connected. I believe that the church has a future because it can be an expression of that great human need for connection. Because when we are connected, we really can change the world. And in the process of changing the world, we are being changed ourselves for the better. And that, my friends, is not something you're likely to get on Twitter or Facebook. I'm staying in church because, as irritating as I can be, I sense that at times you need me. And I am perfectly aware that without you, I might become the king of the asses. But together, we may become better people while we help to make the world a better place. Amen.
You've been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at reverenddray@aol.com for more information.